As usual, you're being recorded. Okay, quick announcement. You may not have noticed, but if you have, since it's been up a while, you have your last major grade is posted on the hub. So there are two major grades left. One of them is a test that will be assigned on Thursday of next week. And then one of them is a memo that is due on, when did I say it was due? Due on December 3rd. So you still have about 3 weeks on that one. Okay, 3 weeks from yesterday. So a test next Thursday and a memo due on December 3rd. If you are having trouble remembering how to do a memo, I encourage you to go back and look at those lectures from last cycle. Okay, so everything in the plans on the plans page that says legal analysis and writing, okay, from back in September has all the stuff you need on how to do a memo. And so there are instructions and there's a picture, because reading some of the information might be a little confusing until you see it drawn out. And on the second page of the instructions is a picture for you. Okay, so you have a memo. There's also a quiz due today, or not due today, but that I'm assigning today about what we learn in class. Okay. So, okay. So that's basically the whole rest of the cycle. You've got a test, a quiz, a memo. I think there will be one or two more minor grades, but otherwise, after today, we're not really learning a whole lot of new stuff for this cycle. Okay, the rest of the cycle will be focused on reviewing and making sure that you can demonstrate your what you've learned so far this cycle about property law, and then we will start in with contracts. Contracts will be is a pretty fun unit. So, okay. So with that said, let's talk about what we're going to do today. Today we are talking about a concept called adverse possession. And in my opinion, adverse possession is one of those really cool things about the law that really gets your mind going. So I remember when I first learned about it in law school, I was like, this is cool. I need to, and you start seeing things about it everywhere. And you'll probably find that if you ever read a news article about it or something like that, you'll probably find out that it's all wrong, what they talk about. But for those of you who are a little bit more schemers, like you like to make plans and try to get around things, this is usually a fun lecture. Okay, so in its most basic form, adverse possession is basically the idea that if you act like somebody else's property is yours for long enough, it becomes yours. So let me share the screen over here, and then with that, okay, we're going to draw a picture, and you're going to see, kind of get an idea of what I'm talking about. So first, I'm going to start with the reason this law exists. Okay, so in the old days, before measurements were really accurate, before you had nice, neat little neighborhoods with perfect squares for everybody's houses and stuff, property law back then was a little more iffy than it is now. So I want you to imagine, or property boundaries at least were a little more iffy. So I want you to imagine two neighbors, okay? So you got this little tract of land here, okay? And something like that, okay? And of course, as we do, we're going to say this is owned by A, and this is owned by B. Okay. And let's say at some point, B decides they're going to build a fence to separate their property from A's property. And they do their best. But when they start to build the fence, And in fact, since this is old days, this is actually more maybe a stone wall. Okay. They build it over here. And they build that stone wall right across the property like that. And A thinks they're building it on the line, B thinks they're building on the line. So they just continue. Okay. And over time, let's say B. So of course there's a roadway down here, right? Right, so there's a road. And so to connect to the road, B built a little driveway across here like this. All right, and then a few years later, they build a barn over here. And as they develop this area a little more, they plant crops like this, right? Basically, they just go along with everybody in this area thinking that B owns this part, even though A owns that part. Okay. And let's say this goes on for 40 years. And then one day, A is getting ready to sell the property. And he gets somebody to read his deed and figure out where exactly his property lines are. And to his horror, he discovers that his property line is over here and not at the fence. And so he goes to B and he says, B, I want my property back. You're going to have to tear down your barn. You're going to have to tear down this wall. You're going to have to dig up your driveway. You're going to have to dig up these crops because that little sliver of that property is mine. And you've been using it all these years. And in fact, now since you've been using it for 40 years without my permission, you've been trespassing. I want you to pay me for use of my property all these years. Basically, hopefully you're starting to see this is a not a great situation, right? This is, in fact, somebody have a question? Oh, I thought I heard it. And in fact, what would happen in this situation is the court would say, no, this belongs to B now. Okay. So if you've ever heard the phrase, possession is 9/10 of the law, this is one area where that's true. Basically, if people act like they own property and everyone kind of goes along with it, we want them to be the actual owners of the property. We want A, if someone starts building their stuff on A's property, we want A to step in and say, stop, this is mine, you're trespassing, go away, right? If A acts like B owns this property and B acts like B owns this property, we would prefer for this to be B's property, okay? B's using the property, B is making good use of it with crops and barns and stuff, and A is not telling them otherwise. We don't want A to be able to come back a long time later and undo all this stuff that B has done with this property. Okay, so legally, this little sliver here becomes B's. Okay, and that process is called adverse possession. That makes sense so far? I'm going to tell you exactly how it happens. Thank you, Mr. Ramos. All right, so let's start over here. Let's just we're going to erase all this and start over. So I'm going to give you another example here. Okay. So let's once again, we've got a little property. A owns this huge property. Okay, there's roads over here and roads over here. Okay, and this is all owned by A. And then one day B comes along, our little road there, a little road here. Okay, then one day B comes along and B knows that this is not B's property. Okay, and B is like, huh? Oh well, let's build out A's area a little bit. A has a house over here. You know, maybe they have a barn over here. Maybe they have some animals. You know, maybe an animal. I don't know. They have some crops. Okay, they're making good use of all this. But back here, they don't really have anything. Instead, they've got a bunch of trees. Right? So oh. Oh. Like a bunch of trees here. Oh. You know, it's a little forest. Why is it not staying? They've got themselves a nice little forest here. And they don't really do anything with it. Maybe every once in a while they go walking back there. Okay. But otherwise, they just kind of leave it alone. All right. And they've got this forest all over the place. Then one day, B, who doesn't own any property, comes along and says, huh, there's kind of some area back here. And they put up a fence. Oops. They put up a fence here. And they just kind of carve it out. Okay. So B comes along and builds that fence. And they build a house over here. And all the trees that were over here, they cut them down. Okay. So now there's just little stubs, and they sell that wood. Okay. They sell that wood and basically just kind of start treating it like it's their own. Now, this is different from the first situation, right? In the first situation, it was a mistake. It was a mistake, and A and B both thought that B was putting the fence in the right place, and it just turned out they were wrong. But not here. Here, it's clear that B is trespassing, right? It's pretty obvious at this point that B doesn't have a right to do this. This was all A's property, and B knew that they never bought it, they never owned it. This is not B's. Well, guess what? Same thing applies. If A never kicks B off or gives B permission to be there, this will become B's property. So it actually doesn't matter if it's an honest mistake or if B is intentionally trying to take the property. The same process causes it to become B's. You might say, well, why is that? Well, the reason is because A wasn't using this property. A was obviously not checking up on it. They weren't exercising their right of exclusion. They weren't doing anything with those trees. They were just letting it sit there and so long that somebody could move onto the property, put up a fence, and build a house, and A didn't say a single thing about it. In that case, we don't like to sit there unused, unwatched, unmaintained, and we say if someone is going to do that with a property, we're kind of fine with them having it. Okay, so the concept of adverse possession developed in the common law to accommodate both of these situations, right? Where if there's a mistake about where the property line is or something like that, and no one catches it, it becomes the owner who's using its property. If someone uses a property like this, then it becomes theirs. If the other person doesn't do anything about it. Okay? So we're going to talk about what's the process? What's the legal requirements to get something through adverse possession? So I'm going to go through the different elements, and you tell me if they sound familiar to you. Okay, so first, you must have actual possession. So B can't come over here and go, I think I should build a fence. And then nothing happened. I mean, then yeah, they have to actually go and use the property as if they own it. Okay, so actual possession is part one. Part two, it must be adverse and hostile, meaning without permission. If they were doing with this with permission, that's just renting it, right? They have a license. No, you can't have a license. You can't have permission. This has to be done without permission. Okay, it has to be open and notorious, not secret. B can't be sneaking into the woods in the middle of the night and camping there, and camping there forever, and A not notice, and suddenly the forest becomes B's. No, you have to be doing it as if you own the place, right? I don't come home and sneak in at 2 a.m. and hope none of the neighbors notice. No, I walk in my front door in broad daylight because it's my house, right? That's how you have to be using this, out in the open. For anyone who wants to see if you are using the property, can see you're using the property. Okay, so open and notorious. And it must be continuous, right? So you have to use it as if you owned it for, in Texas, 10 years. What does that sound like to you? Something we've already learned.
Prescriptive easement?
Absolutely right. It's like a prescriptive easement. The difference between adverse possession and prescriptive easement is there's an additional requirement, and that is that for adverse possession, it has to also be exclusive. Okay, so I put the requirements there in chat for you, the elements of adverse possession. Exclusive means that ownership is limited to the adverse possessor, B in this case. Okay, so B isn't sharing the property with anyone else. So with an easement, you're sharing the property, right? So, if you go back to this picture here, if this was how the property was actually set up and B was crossing it, B was crossing the property like this, right? And going to this road over here. They're not acting like they own this property. They're just acting like they have the right to cross it, right? But they're not keeping A off the property. They're not keeping A from walking there. They're not keeping anyone else from walking there. But that's different from this area over here where B has built a fence, built a house, right? They're not letting A onto this property. They're not letting random people onto this property, right? They might invite somebody over, but they invite them over as an owner, right? If I invite my brother over to play games, I'm not saying he has any ownership. He only comes to my house with my permission. Same thing here. People only come onto this property with B's permission. That's exclusive, right? So basically, if you remember the property rights, and exclusion is one of the property rights in that bundle, you have to exercise your right of exclusion. So let me give you an example of where all these other elements might get met, but not exclusion. All right, so you may have seen or heard of the idea of abandoned houses, right? In a neighborhood, no one lives there. Maybe the old owners died. Maybe it was foreclosed on, right? Something like that. And the property just becomes abandoned. Maybe people forget something or whatever. And people start to move in there. Sometimes it's homeless people. Sometimes it's drug addicts that are looking for a place to hide out. Whatever it could be any number of reasons, right? But people start to use abandoned property for various reasons. But right, we're talking about multiple people doing that. We're talking about a bunch of people who aren't related to each other moving onto this property, and so they might be fulfilling a lot of these. They're really using it, and they're using it without permission, and maybe it's open and notorious, right? And they may even continue using it for 10 years, but if they're not kicking the other people out, and say, no, this is my property, you need to leave, it's not exclusive. Okay, they will not take it by adverse possession. In order for it to qualify for adverse possession, you have to act like you own it and that you don't share that ownership with anybody else, except maybe, family. Okay, does that make sense? So those elements there, 1, 2, 3, and 4, they all, you can really think of them all together as acting like you own the property. And then you have to do that for 10 years. All right. And then it becomes yours. Now, I do want to clarify something on the continuous thing, okay? Continuous doesn't mean that you can never leave the property, right? So in our example, B might go to work. He might go visit. He might go on vacation. It's not considered abandoned just because you go on vacation, right? I'm a teacher. I get 2 or 3 months off in the summertime. If I take a long vacation, my house isn't abandoned. I'm not giving up my property rights. It's the same thing with adverse possession and easements. For purposes of continuous, as long as the continuous is consistent with normal ownership, like B doesn't just move somewhere else and really abandon the property, then going on vacation can still count as continuous. Okay. So that's important for you to keep in mind. There are some questions about that on the quiz today. Okay. Do y'all feel like you understand this so far? Cool. Awesome. Okay, I have one more thing I'm going to teach you about this. Thank you. Is there anybody who wants me to explain something in more detail? I'm happy to answer any of these concepts better. Okay. So one more thing I want to teach you, and that is the concept of tacking. Tacking is the idea that if one person starts to adversely possess a property, then or to start on the path of a prescriptive easement, and they transfer their rights, whatever those rights may be, to someone else, the time limit applies to both of them. You add their time limits together. So let me give you an example here. So let's go back to our little masterpiece, my Renaissance painting here. Okay. So let's say B moves onto this property and B is there for 6 years. Does B own this property yet?
No.
No, absolutely right. No. After 6 years, A can go to B and say, get off my lawn. Right? They can sue to evict. Okay, they can sue for trespassing. They can try to get the court to make them pay money. They can say all this stuff that you've just put on my property, it belongs to me. They can sue them for stealing those trees. Okay. After 6 years, this is not that's not long enough. B does not own this. Okay. But let's say A hasn't said anything yet. And so B, after 6 years, sells the property to C. And C lives there for 6 years. I just picked 6. This could be 5 and 7, whatever. So at that point, C has only been there 6 years. But guess what? These two numbers are added together for the purpose of adverse possession. Okay, that's a process called tacking. And the reason for that is somebody has been claiming this property away from A for at least 10 years, and they are in vertical privity with one another. So remember, we talked about vertical privity. In this case, B sold their rights to C, whatever their rights were. Now, I want to point out, if there's not vertical privity, then you don't get tacking. So instead, if B hadn't sold it, but instead C had come along and built a fence right here and started their own little adverse possession, they don't get to take advantage of B's 6 years to try to claim this little area right there that I just filled in. Okay, that's not how tacking works. Tacking has to be with vertical privity, meaning that B transferred their rights to C, right? So B's saying, look, I've got 6 years on this property. I'm going to sell this property to you. And then when you hit the 10-year mark, then you get this property from A. Okay, so basically B exercises their right of transfer as if they own the property, right? So, and then it continues. The reason tacking exists is because if tacking did not exist, then when B went the full 10 years and it became theirs, they wouldn't be able to sell it without tacking, right? So let's say B owned it for 10 years, let's say, or 20 years. They were sitting here a long time and adverse possession happened, okay? And then they tried to sell it to C. Well, then C was there for 2 years, and then A came along and said, get off my property. C would not have qualified for adverse possession. So tacking is necessary for there to be full ownership there, okay? But one of the upshots of tacking is that it helps you when no one has been there for a full 10 years. Right? Think about your life. Most of you have not lived in one place for 10 years. It's totally normal to be somewhere 6 years or so and move on. Okay. So we allow tacking because this property is being used and we want it to become its own property separate from A, if A is not going to do anything about it over the course of 10 years. Does that make sense? Okay. So last thing, if you are A and you don't want B to be able to get this property through adverse possession, then what you do is you have to knock out one of those requirements. So there are 5 requirements, right? You can knock out several of them. Okay. The most common ones that you're going to knock out are either continuous or adverse and hostile. Okay, so you can knock out continuous by evicting them before 10 years is up. Okay, sue them, call the cops, something to get them off the property so that they're not acting like they own it anymore. Okay, and by doing that, you get rid of continuous. If you sue them and the sheriff comes and takes and escorts them from the property, and you go bulldoze their house and tear up their fence, then if they come back, they have to start over again, right? They haven't been living there as if they own the property for 10 years. Okay, so that's one way. The other way is you can get rid of adverse and hostile by just giving them permission. Okay, you just say, hey, I'm actually, this is my property, but I understand you need a place to stay. Why don't you pay me $1 a month to live here, right? And you draw up a little contract and you say, look, you have my permission to be here. And then when you finally get around to wanting them to leave, you just say, all right, you have to leave now. And then when they don't leave, then you call the cops, right? But that way they can't say they've been living there as if they own the place for 10 years because they've been living there as if you own the place and gave them permission. Now they might say something like, I reject your permission and you can't give me permission because it's mine, at which point you need to call the cops and and sue them, right? But assuming that they say, oh, thank you, yeah, here's $1 or whatever, or they sign the agreement that says they can stay there, then you've defeated adverse and hostile, right? You now have proof that you gave them permission to be there. Okay, so those are the two most common ways. Could you go over what would happen if someone was selling something from your property for 10 plus years but not living there? So that's depends, right? So think about this. Let's say, right, look at this this little area. A is not using this back half of his property, right? What does A have the right to do? A has the right to chop down these trees and sell them, right? And does anybody else have the right to do that? No, right? Only A. These are A's trees. If someone else chops down a tree and sells them, they're acting, they've committed theft. They were trespassing. Okay, they're doing all these things wrong. A needs to be the one to tell them, no, you need to go away. If they continue, maybe they plant a new tree and chop down another one, and plant a new tree and chop down another one. If they keep doing that, like basically they just keep harvesting these trees like it's theirs, there's lots of people who own property who treat their property that way. They don't have to live. You don't have to live there to treat it like it's yours. Okay, there's lots of ways. So I'm glad you asked that question because, for example, let's say B put up this fence and built a house, and then never lived there and started renting it out to C. Well, who's acting like they own that place? B is. Right? B doesn't have to live there to act like they own it. If they're renting it out to someone else, it's the same thing. Lots of people own property they don't live on or ever visit at all. Okay. Did I answer your question? Yep. Yep. And when you say file for ownership, they go to a court and ask the judge to declare that they own the property. That's how that file for ownership works. Oftentimes that doesn't happen until A gets, finds out about it, 15 years later and tries to evict B. And in that lawsuit, B will say, actually, judge, I want you to declare that I own the property. So the judge will say, no, you can't evict them because it's not yours. And yes, B owns it. And so now you have a court order saying you own the property. That's usually how filing for ownership works. But the same thing would happen if C was renting this property from B, or if B was coming along and cutting down these trees without A's permission for 10 years. Okay, same thing. As long as you are treating the property like it is yours in a manner that is consistent with ownership. Okay, so there's lots of ways to own properties besides just living there. As long as you're doing something as if you own the property, it's out in the open, you're not hiding it. There you go. You're welcome. That was a good question. Any other questions? Okay. Well, then you are on flex time. There is like I said, there's a quiz. Miss Crumbling was asking about a question on the quiz there. There is a memo with it. There is an article on adverse possession there for you. They combine continuous and exclusive, and I don't know why. All right, so they say there's only 4 requirements, but they call continuous and exclusive separate things. It's weird, but otherwise the rest of the article is good, so I put it there. And then once you're done with those things, you are done with this week's classes. You are free to go. All right, have a great weekend, great afternoon, and I will see y'all on Tuesday.